Sheikh Hamdan stood beneath the moonlit dunes, his gaze lost in the horizon where memory and mirage met. He could still hear her voice, not in words, but in echoes that clung to the air like a sacred secret. She had spoken once, just once, but her voice had carved its mark upon the desert itself. Since then, every grain of sand, every whisper of wind, seemed to hum her name. The desert had remembered her, and in that memory, he had found both heaven and heartbreak. It was not what she said that mattered, it was how she said it. Her voice carried something the world no longer knew how to hold: truth. It wasn't loud, nor royal, nor rehearsed. It was soft, steady, like the calm before dawn, and yet it shook the walls of his soul. She had looked at him not as a prince, but as a man who had forgotten how to breathe freely. That single moment had undone years of discipline, of royal silence, of trained smiles. It was the first time the desert had heard love spoken in its own language. She stood there, wrapped in simplicity, her eyes brighter than the stars that bowed to the dunes. Some hearts are not meant to be ruled, she had said, and he had felt the words strike him deeper than any sword could. It wasn't defiance, it was destiny speaking through her lips. In that moment, he realized that love wasn't something he could command. It was something that chose to exist, even in the silence between them. Her words were few, but they lingered like perfume in the wind, refusing to fade. The desert had witnessed countless oaths, countless kings, countless empires that rose and fell. But none were as eternal as her single sentence. It was as if nature itself had chosen to keep her voice alive. The winds began to hum her tone. The dunes seemed to shift and sigh in rhythm with her words. Even the falcons that soared above the golden skyline seemed to carry her memory in their flight. She had spoken once, and the desert, in all its timelessness, had sworn never to forget. He returned to that place often, where her shadow once touched his heart. Sometimes he would ride alone at dawn, just to hear the echo of her words in the wind. The people called it madness, but to him, it was prayer. Every hoofbeat against the sand was a syllable of her memory. Every gust of air carried a piece of her voice. She had become the poetry that refused to die, the silence that refused to sleep. And even the desert, vast, unfeeling, eternal, had bowed to her truth. There were moments when he could almost hear her laughter ripple through the dunes. It was not the laughter of joy, but of knowing, the sound of a soul that had understood life too deeply. It reminded him that not all love stories are meant to be written in gold. Some are carved into the air, meant to be felt, not seen. Her single sentence had become his lifetime of meaning. He realized then that sometimes one voice could change everything, not by shouting, but by whispering at the right moment. He had built palaces, led nations, written poetry that made the world sigh, but none of that compared to what she had created in him with a single breath. She had rebuilt his soul, and he had spent every day since then trying to live up to her silence. People saw the prince, the leader, the poet, but she saw the man who longed to be understood without explanation. Her words had given him that rare gift, the courage to feel without fear. The night she left, the desert wept. The winds grew wild, the moon dimmed as if mourning her absence. Yet even in her departure, she left behind something immortal. Her presence became the language of the land, her silence, the melody of eternity. He wrote of her in verses the world adored, but none of them captured her essence. How could ink ever hold something that the universe itself couldn't contain? She was more than a memory, she was a phenomenon. Years passed, kingdoms changed, yet her voice still echoed through the dunes. Travelers who passed through the desert often spoke of a strange stillness, as if time paused for something sacred. They said the wind carried a woman's whisper, gentle yet commanding, sorrowful yet divine. Fazza knew the truth, it wasn't the desert they heard. It was love itself, eternal and unbroken, wrapped in her single spoken moment. He often wondered if she knew what she had done to him.
There were nights when he could no longer tell where her memory ended and the desert began. Every path he took seemed to lead back to that moment, the moment her voice became part of creation. He wondered if this was what destiny truly meant, not something you chase, but something that finds you, speaks once, and never leaves. Her words had become the rhythm of his existence, the heartbeat beneath the quiet. Even when the world applauded his strength, it was her silence that gave him the power to stand tall. He often dreamt of her standing by the horizon again, veiled in light, her hair caught by the wind that had once memorized her scent. In those dreams, she didn't speak, she only smiled, as if she already knew he had spent his life turning her single sentence into poetry. He would wake with tears on his face, unsure if they belonged to grief or gratitude. Maybe both. For in losing her, he had found the most beautiful kind of eternity, one that existed not in possession, but in remembrance. Sometimes, he would ride deep into the heart of the desert, where no sound but his heartbeat could be heard. There, he would speak softly to the winds, telling them stories of how her words changed him. "You remember her," he'd say to the dunes, "don't you?" And the sand would shimmer in answer, the wind swirling as though agreeing that she was never truly gone. The desert had become his companion, a silent witness to a love that defied time, a love that needed no second voice to exist. There were poets before him, and there would be poets after him, but none would understand what he had lived through. For him, poetry was not art, it was survival. Each verse he wrote was a step closer to her memory, each rhyme a way to touch her presence again. The world read his poems as love stories, but he knew they were actually confessions, confessions to the one whose voice had rewritten the rhythm of his soul. She had given him a single sentence, and he had turned it into a lifetime of meaning. He often thought about what might have happened if she had spoken again. Would it have ruined the magic? Would more words have diluted the eternity in her silence? Perhaps love, in its purest form, needs no repetition. Perhaps the greatest truths are spoken only once, and then lived forever in silence. He realized then that what she gave him was not closure, but infinity. Her voice was a key, and his heart was the door it opened, one that would never close again. When he wrote